Hello, my name is Micaela Mika De La Rosa, and I'm currently a student in the Master of Science in Interdisciplinary Studies at Texas State University, part of the Occupational Workforce and Leadership Studies program. Before coming to Texas State, I graduated from UT Austin and got my bachelor's in math and a business certificate. Before taking the OCED 5360 Leadership Studies course, I had some knowledge of leadership after holding a few positions of leadership within organizations that I was involved with. I also briefly touched upon leadership when I took a management course for my business certificate. Now, after almost being done with this class, I have learned more about the background behind leadership, such as leadership theories, approaches to leadership, ethical and cultural leadership, and other leadership approaches and theories. The book that I have chosen for this assignment is called Alive, The Story of the Andes Survivors by Piers Paul Reed. I have added the bibliographical citation for the book here on this slide, as well as a picture of what the book looks like. This book is about an airplane that crashed in the Andes and how 16 of the 45 people who were on that plane survived. I will go into more detail about the story and summary itself, but first I want to discuss why I chose this book. I had first heard of this book when I took a management class at UT when we discussed the topic of leadership. So I had heard of what the book was about before, but had never actually picked it up to read it. The minute I saw this book on several of the recommended reading lists, I couldn't pass up on this offer. I absolutely had to read it. Another main reason why I chose this book was because I like stories that have adventure and have intense storylines that deal with ethical and moral issues, which I will discuss later in my presentation. The intention of this book was to give a factual, nonfiction story about a real event that happened and how the survivors did what they needed to in order to survive. The author interviewed the survivors and wrote the book based on those interviews. The language that the book uses, I think, is suitable for graduate study. The language itself discusses lots of imagery and goes into much description on what the survivors of the crash had to deal with. The author's work is relevant to my interests and hopefully that of my classmates because it goes into much detail about what leadership skills some of the characters in the story had in order to survive in the conditions that were described in the book. I generally like thriller and action adventure like books, so I knew I was in for a treat when I picked up Alive. Alive is a true story about a Uruguayan rugby team who was traveling with family and friends to Chile for a rugby match. While the team was heading to Chile on October 13, 1972, the plane crashed in the Andes Mountains. Some people died instantly, others died a few days after the crash, quite a few died in an avalanche, and 3 others died within days apart before the survivors were rescued. During this time, a rescue team was sent out within the first few days of the crash, and since nothing was found within these few days, the rescue team ended the search. After the search was called off, the 45 people had to find ways to survive in below zero temperatures and make food last as long as possible. When food supply was running short, some of the survivors realized that it was necessary to eat the bodies of the dead in order to stay alive. Out of the 45 people who were on the plane, only 16 ended up surviving. Of the 16 that survived, these people were not rescued until December 22nd and 23rd, 1972, which is a little more than 2 months after the crash. After Canessa and Parado, who were characters in the story, finally went to go search for help. The author originally wrote this book a couple of years after the disaster happened. As I mentioned earlier, the author wanted this story to be as accurate as possible. So in order to do this, he ended up interviewing most of the 16 survivors on their experiences and wanted facts on the crash. The main points that the author wants to address is that he wanted to give the audience first-hand perspective to the reader how the survivors were able to survive for those 72 days that they were in the mountains. As far as leadership qualities are concerned, I found that Alive seemed to show several leadership topics that we discussed in class. These include uses of the situational approach, ethical leadership approach, and transformational approach. All of these approaches seem to have connections with each other. These qualities, among others, are what make up a leader. I will go into detail how I was able to find all of these qualities when I read Alive. I believe the situational approach is used quite often throughout the book Alive. According to Nordhaus, situational approach focuses on leadership in situations. The primary idea of situational approach is that different situations demand different kinds of leadership. These are both from Nordhaus 2016. Using this definition, the most obvious example would be where Canessa and Parrado stepped up to become leaders of the survivors for the benefit of the group as well as for themselves. Canessa and Parrado were investing in the group in that they both climbed the mountains in order to find help for the other survivors. One of the biggest ideas in situational leadership, according to Grulke, is that leaders invest in their people, allowing them to seek out education, empowering them to participate in a variety of experiences. Grulke, 2015. In this sense, I consider this event a situational approach because the leaders changed due to the situation at hand. Along with the situation approaches comes ethics. Ethics seems to be one of the key points of Alive. According to Nordhaus, ethics is concerned with the kinds of values and morals an individual or society finds desirable or appropriate, and concerned with the virtuousness of individuals and motives, both of those Nordhaus 2016. The most obvious example where ethics was used was the idea that the survivors resorted to cannibalism. The book mentioned that almost all of the survivors were Roman Catholic, and they knew that it was ethically and morally wrong to eat other people. Some ways that the survivors justified cannibalism was using the Bible scriptures, which involved laying down your life for your friends. Another justification was the only reason that they survived was that God wanted them alive by any means, even if that means eating their dead family and friends. One big idea of ethics is that this is a growing topic that needs to be discussed in business classes since it has become a big problem in recent times. More and more research is coming out regarding ethics in leadership, which means that according to Calshoven and Taylor, it seems to show us more attention being paid to ideas and practice, and that it indicates how leadership, leaders, and leading have become more central. Calshoven and Taylor, 2018. Going off of ethics, we can see that transformational leadership also seems to be a big idea in the book. According to Nordhaus, transformational leadership is a process that changes and transforms people, Nordhaus 2016. I feel like the changing ethical values regarding cannibalism relates to transformational leadership in that this also changes the characters themselves. This applies to both the leaders and followers in the book. According to Khan and Ismail, transformational leadership seems to have a relationship with the culture of the group. Khan and Ismail, 2017. This is evident when religious views and cannibalism seem to conflict each other. Seeing cannibalism as ethical in this case balances with what the survivors were taught before this tragedy and in this sense changes them for survival purposes. As far as organizational structure of the book is concerned, I would say for the most part it promotes understanding. The only reason I can come up with that it would hinder The only reason that I came up with that it could hinder understanding is the fact that some of the book jumps around from one scene to another. For example, one section describes at the beginning most of the passengers praying for help, and another section describes when the search for survivors started, and the section right after that discusses that the survivors lose hope when the search gets called off. I believe the author does this to show simultaneous events happening at one time so that the reader can understand that while the passengers were waiting, that the search began. Even though the book has some transitions as mentioned earlier, I would say that the transitions between each section are relatively clear. The book I thought was very coherent and easy to understand. I would definitely say that the sources used by the author are accessible to the audience and reliable. As mentioned before, the author wanted the story to be as accurate as possible. In order to do that, he interviewed and wrote down exactly what some of the survivors experienced during the disaster and while waiting for rescue. The author mentions in the acknowledgments that he was tempted to fictionalize some of the story, but realized that he wanted people to hear from the sources, i.e., the passengers. Because of how accurate the author wanted the story to be, I would probably say that Alive is probably less biased than most books that tried to fabricate and over-exaggerate tragedies like this. I wouldn't say it's without bias, however. There are some parts I think that could be questionable. For example, I believe the author did the best that they could to describe the plane crash itself, but I also think that because this was so traumatic to the passengers, that even the passengers themselves could have over-exaggerated the actual crash due to intense fear, being in shock, knocked out, whatever the case may be. In other words, the passengers could have felt so frightened that they couldn't even accurately describe the crash. This is just a theory, however. Maybe the crash was just as they described, but it's also another thing to remember that PTSD can also get in the way of accurate memory too. Again, I want to emphasize that I'm not saying what the author said isn't true, but just that we as readers won't ever truly know the experience unless it happens to us. When I first read the book, I was hoping to learn more about how leadership is applied in a situation like this one. I would say the book exceeded my expectations. I was mostly surprised that the survivors resorted to cannibalism in order to survive. I can understand why they had to go against their moral and ethical values to survive, though. I also found it surprising that the survivors were using the Bible passage to justify the cannibalism. I was also amazed that the 16 survivors were able to make it that long in cold temperatures with little food to rely on. To me, that's incredible. I feel that this book very much contributes to my own learning about leadership. I realize that yes, this is a nonfiction disaster story, so some people might see this and think, I didn't see much about leadership here. But for me, this book was nothing but leadership due to the serious decisions that were made. These decisions were not only with resorting to cannibalism, but with deciding when to go get help, how they were going to get help, among many other decisions. With all this being said, I would definitely recommend the book to anyone who likes disaster stories like these. A movie based on the book came out in the 90s, so it would be good to make the comparison between the book and movie if you ever have the chance. Here are my references below. Thanks for watching.